So I'm Ramia Mazé. Since 2020, I've been Professor of Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability at University of the Arts here in London. You can learn more about me at the link in this slide, and all the slides are now saved as a PDF in your chat, which you can repost because I put a lot of links throughout the slides, which you may want to look at in parallel to the things I'm showing on the screen, or maybe you want to keep the slides to go back and look for later. But there's lots of kind of signposts to different kind of resources that you might like to have in the slide set itself. I'm going to start with a more recent experience of mine, which Mariana will know very well. This is a course that I was involved in leading in Aalto University in Finland called Design for Government. It was a 10 ECTS course at the master's level, gathering students from not only design, but many disciplines and, in fact, several universities. And we celebrated in autumn the 10-year anniversary of Design for Government at the International Design in Government Conference organized by Annie Leppänen, among many others, also including Mariana Salgado. And for me, this marked a kind of milestone in that course, but also a milestone at the 10-year milestone in a kind of a wave of people engaging with this topic of design for government, design in government. And it felt like that at the conference, that we kind of come to a moment, a milestone in that discourse and in that community. If you're interested in that course, there was also at the in the conference there was a kind of orientation to the course over the 10 years that it's expanded and evolved. There's a link in the bottom of the slides that you'll find in the chat if you want to look at the video of that to kind of see that course in action. But DFG, Design for Government, for me is an index of a wider phenomenon. Of course, it was producing students, graduates that went on to work and are working in governments around the world. So it's a phenomenon in and of itself in this wave of design for government, but it's also part of a bigger wave in many, many ways. There's been a rapid rise and expansion of design for policy and public administrations around the world over the past 2 decades. The proliferation of innovation or policy labs, the recruitment of professional designers, all of this signals the increasing institutionalization of design in central and local governments. We have a kind of perhaps a present day design wave. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to clear my screen there. So this expansion, and DFG is part of that, maybe signals a kind of a present day design wave, to borrow the words of Arwen van Buren and his colleagues. But this is not only a recent phenomenon. Guy Peters and others trace the preference for the term for the idea policy design going back many, many decades. Policy design over alternative and competing ideas such as policy formulation, policy creation, policy innovation, policy development. In fact, the word design is significant as a kind of an index also in policy studies and public administration of a certain kind of desire, of a certain kind of knowledge, or a certain kind of hype or buzz, depending on how you want to think about it. And and more recently, the idea of design for policy, Christian Basin, Sabina Uniger, colleagues, maybe many of you, have been used to frame this more recently emerging space of people trying to frame not only practice, but also scholarship in this space between disciplines. But, and this is what I felt in the air in Helsinki in autumn already, and in the colleagues' conversations before and after, we're at a kind of a moment to think and rethink, what is this space that's emerging between the disciplines? What's at stake in this? And what do we need to do next? We've been in a space where practice is really rapidly outpacing scholarship, the proliferation of designers, all sorts of designers, all sorts of things called design in policy spaces. For me, practice has outpaced scholarship, and now this calls for me and people like me that it's time for research, for scholarship on this phenomenon, the discrete phenomena of individual designers, design lab, courses like design for government, but also the larger phenomena of design in this moment in time in our societies and in our governments. What is this that's happening? This is also a moment when design means many, many things. Design is one of those things that policymakers keep wanting definitions of, but I find it very difficult and perhaps undesirable or impossible to define in a crystal clear way. But yet, there are many kinds of design in government. We need to think maybe this is the time to survey what's happening in these spaces. There's also but in terms of the claim versus the reality of what design can do or should do. After many, many design experiments, labs that have come and gone, what is design claiming it can do that's different or distinct from other disciplines, other kinds of knowledges, other kinds of practices? This is maybe aligned with what Annie Leppänen at Helsinki was talking about. We've been in the kind of teenager years of design, really, promoting, selling, doing, but how do the words match the reality of what we're able to do, what we can do versus what others can do, and maybe even the limits of what we can do as designers, also given the current competence and knowledge base of professional designers. So maybe it's time to also deepen so that our words and our actions match and align more clearly. And for me, it's also a time to interrogate disciplinary relations. Implicit in this phrase, design for policy, is that design is a discipline in service for policy. So it's not design and policy, which is the formulation I'm currently using with colleagues. Design for policy implies a certain kind of relationship between those disciplines. And I find this really intriguing, and I'll be talking a bit more about this today. Some of these starting ideas are captured in the early paper by me, Lucy Kimball, Catherine DeRose, and Liz Richardson in a paper at Design Research Society conference some years ago. So some of this background is presented there, and we've advanced in some ways since then. But this is the kind of landscape that I've been experiencing for the past couple of years. So design for government is maybe an index of this larger present day design wave and policy, but also this design wave and policy I find to be an index of a much larger and longer phenomenon. Let's see if I can, there we go. The design wave and policy is one of many turns toward design, what we might call a design turn more generally in multiple disciplines, in multiple sectors, which in my argumentation requires the development of critical studies and critical practices of design at this inflection point that we're in now. The notion of design turn is one that several design scholars, but also several beyond design, are starting to theorize and interrogate in different ways. Colleagues Claudia Mares and Anke Grundel in Berlin and also here in the UK have coined this term, and coined this term, the design turn, coming soon in a forthcoming special issue, and they've written about it in different ways in different publications as well. And they take the term as per the cultural historian Wolfgang Schaffner, whose scholarship kind of in the early decade of the 2000s took place in the context of particular approaches to media theory that were evolving in Germany, involving, for example, Foucault and other people looking at, well, how are these platforms, these technologies, this kind of forms of media also shaping the world around us? The design of these technologies and platforms shaping the world around us. He was also writing at the time with the rise of interdisciplinary research institutes in Germany, and we've experienced many of those ourselves as well. In Claudia Mares and Anke Grundel's terms, the design turn is the latest in the culmination in a series of epistemological revolutions. We might be familiar with the material turn, the practice turn, as different kinds of knowledge coming to the forefront as pivotal in particular moments or phases of our kind of knowledge evolution. And the design turn might be proposed as the latest and culmination of those turns. They also use the concept as a tool to examine the expanding influence of in design in different disciplines. So design as coming into focus as relevant to ethics and law, nanotech and biology. So disciplines not adjacent to design, quite far from design, are turning their attention to design for various reasons. Another that's been talking about the design turn is Cameron Tonkin-Wise, and he talks in this article about the design turn of the university or higher education sector in itself, the whole research and innovation systems, even at our national or European levels, where the key ingredient has been proposed, maybe is even kind of recognized, is design in the act of kind of repurposing higher education in service of a contemporary form of knowledge economy. We see design being positioned as bridging between different disciplines, between the humanities and the sciences, as a communicator of basic knowledge to more applied forms of knowledge, and even also kind of as a bridge out of the university to other societal sectors beyond those core foundational old traditional disciplines. So in this light, this kind of design turn in the universities or the research sector, we might be thinking about so-called mode two knowledge, where there's a movement and what we might analyze as a design turn from basic forms of knowledge in traditional disciplines towards more applied, more societally relevant, and more kind of communicable, accessible, publicly, or even transdisciplinarily produced knowledges. So these are two different instantiations of what the design turn might be like. And if you're interested, especially in this latter notion, the design turn in the university sector, you might be especially interested in this article quite close to home for those of you in Sweden that I wrote with Marie Hellström Remer, which looked at this design turn in Sweden at the moment before and at the in the setup of Designfakulteten, the National Doctoral School in Design, which 19 universities throughout Sweden took part in, including at least several of yours here. And what we did in this article is we did after the closing of Designfakulteten, we went back and looked at the impetuses that perhaps were part of the setup and the initial funding of Designfakulteten, how the setup evolved and changed over time in light of the way that what we might call design wave expanded in different ways and started to be instantiated in those 19 universities and the doctoral research projects of those participating in Designfakulteten. And in this article, we theorize based on the kind of rhetoric of design and arts research generally at the time is design is a kind of a third space or third culture, bridging between older research cultures, humanity and sciences, design entering the academy, the university as a space of doing that bridging work, the bridging between disciplines and the bridging from those kinds of knowledges out into society. And that was the kind of ethos of the time. And many were talking about this kind of design and arts as a third culture, bridging and kind of communicating based and applying research in various ways, as in the notion of mode two research. What we did in this article was to kind of problematize that as these disciplines and different knowledges interacted, intersected, took different forms in different institutional, regional, and national contexts. The story is in fact much more complicated and nuanced. So we theorized the trans in that transdisciplinary, the third space transversal kind of concept, to kind of problematize that clean, neat kind of hype story into a more critical and contextual account of what actually happened in Designfakulteten and the students' projects at that time. And we argue that design researchers, including doctoral students, and also our own critical institutional practice, requires increased sensitivity as concerns the politics of knowledge, how that can be instrumentalized to different purposes in ways beyond our control and for political purposes beyond our control, for example. That we might need to look in more differentiated and hybrid ways of relations between those kinds of knowledges and those different, the way that design looks different in different settings, interacting in different ways with the local political realities, as well as the different institutional and disciplinary setups. So if you're interested in this design turn in the Swedish context and the research education context, this might be an interesting article for you. And my history itself as a researcher has been one of riding this, I would call, design wave or design turn, since many years starting out as a designer, accidentally placed in the Interactive Institute in Sweden back in 2001, through to a series of projects in the beginning, especially highly practice-based, and more recently, much more theoretical and more critically oriented. Looking at how design was kind of touching on these different disciplines as other disciplines turned toward design and its design turned to become relevant to those other disciplines that can range from high-tech things like FP5, kind of smart, it's ubiquitous computing contexts. It can be community innovation, bottom-up grassroots development projects, as in social innovation. It can be more recently, and what I'll talk about more today, is the kind of design turning towards policy, public administration, etc. And more recently, design in the space of just climate transitions and transitions research more generally. And this has been the story of my kind of design turning, which I think also does mirror some of the larger growth and kind of turns to and fro that design in general and design research has been taking over these years. And so for me, this is an inflection point also in a career sense. What's happening now? Where is design turning now? What have we got within design, and what from that turns towards others? What from other research areas, from other disciplines, turns towards and needs design? And how can those relationships be developed in nuanced, substantive, and critical ways? So, Maria, and I've been looking at this in different ways. My research focus has changed, as you can see, through these kind of projects over the years. I've looked at this design turn in various kinds of disciplinary contexts. For example, design in relation to futures studies has been a big focus of mine in previous years. And if you're interested in that, here's a couple of interesting papers that you might want to look forward to, where I'm debating with future studies researchers and highly interdisciplinary in the Right Hand Feminist Futures project, highly interdisciplinary kind of collection of authors within Sweden and beyond around different forms of feminist futures and how that can intersect across disciplines in various ways. Today, I'll focus more on design in relation to government and policy. But I won't lose the sense of criticality that I hope I bring to all the projects. Maria and I, in the article around design facultaten, refer to and evoke Homi Bhabha, the cultural studies thinker, and his notion of kind of debunking the idea of disciplines or knowledge cultures as solid, centralized, with clear borders, easily visible and comparable with one another. In fact, he kind of talks about these as constantly moving, highly heterogeneous kinds of cultures. And he talks about the space between, not as solid borders or territories to be defended or sold from one across the other, or guarded, as in defensive insularity, which Cameron Tonkin-Wise argues that design can be defensive insularity. Instead, Homi Bhabha talks about the agitated edges where things are moving, where there are different kinds of confrontations, and things may turn to or from in not smooth ways, but in ways that need to be really listened to and evolve in the sense that Maria and I talk about in relation to design research in Sweden in different contexts. And for me, this also resonates with other notions of inter or transdisciplinarity. Andrew Barry, with his colleagues in an article called Logics of Interdisciplinarity, referred to a series of case studies, the rise of several interdisciplines, the interdiscipline of art science, which I would argue the Interactive Institute in Sweden, the Media Lab in the US, these kind of turn of the century, third culture kind of interdisciplinary experiments, that's one of their case studies, this art science interdiscipline. They also look at environmental research as a nexus of many different kinds of disciplines. And they look at several of these. And in terms of talking in this kind of problematizing way about how disciplines and different knowledges meet and interact and transform one another in those interactions. And they come up with three different types of interdisciplinarity. One that they call integration synthesis, one that they call subordination service, and one that they call agonistic antagonistic. And I find this really helpful to start to think about what is the relation between design discipline or how I position design and how another researcher or another discipline or someone outside of our academic contexts finds their knowledge in relation to my own. And I think this is an interesting way to think about what's happening in this design turn as other disciplines and parts of society turn towards design, and as we in design turn towards other disciplines and other parts of society. Are we doing this as an integrating synthesis kind of way? Are we, in fact, operating more in service or in a subordination or hierarchical way to other forms of knowledge towards other disciplines? Or are we doing this in an agonistic or antagonistic kind of dialogue where we pay attention to the frictions or the agitation that happens as our knowledges meet in different ways? So that's the kind of thing I find at stake in this design turn, maybe also in this present day design wave in policy at this kind of inflection point. And I'll focus in a bit more on this design and policy space now for the rest of my lecture here, Design and Government. And I'm going to draw quite heavily on two publications or strands in my research beyond even these two publications. The one on the left is an article that I wrote some years ago now using a particular project, which I'll talk about in a minute, in Cape Town, South Africa, as a case study through which to talk about design governmentality. And the one on the right, which is an ongoing strand of work with Lucy Kimball, Catherine DeRose, and Liz Richardson, and other colleagues looking at different roles or relationships between design and policy. And I'll unfold these stories in a couple of in the remainder of my presentation here. And you can, of course, read much more further about these via the references here. So these are the two critical perspectives that I'm going to kind of tell about or narrate as this design turn. The first one being design governmentalities, and the second being design and policy. And maybe to some extent, again, this lecture I'm giving today is work in progress, and I'm not presenting work that hasn't been published yet. So there are some open ends still that I'm working through in parallel here. But maybe we can see this design governmentalities as a way that I'm seeing that other disciplines such as political theory, policy studies can turn towards and contribute to design, perhaps even necessarily. We are lacking some things in design which we can gain from looking or turning other disciplines towards us. And the second is maybe how we in design can turn towards, through three different relationships, to policy studies and to policy making. So this is perhaps a bit of turning to and from through these two quite different examples or strands in my scholarship. I'll start with the first one, design governmentalities. Long predating the current design wave and policy, design and architecture have long played profound roles in governments and governance. In this article by Sibley and Cavici, they point out how, in fact, law is made real, is made actual through designed forms. This is an article where they talk about governmental national policies, for example, around traffic safety and urban safety. And you can see in the design of cities, infrastructures, roads, parking places, the widths of street, the permissions for parking and riding on the streets, that it's architecture or urban design which has made those laws tangible and real in everyday life. Architecture is the interface between those abstract laws written in national or local governments. Those become real through the design of our streets, through our wayfarers, through our parking permitting systems, through our regulations, which clamp the cars and take them away, etc. In this middle set of images here, those laws and the kind of consequences of those laws, such as paying fees or fines, being legal or illegal in how we occupy the public space, those laws are made real through graphic design, through communication design, through signage. And in the right-hand column, the driver safety laws, the regulations for around seatbelts and lighting of your car's lighting at night, for example. All of these laws are really technically designed into the intricate behaviors and physical mechanisms of cars. Such that all of these forms of law have become so naturalized we don't see them anymore. We don't read the original law. We don't even notice how those forms of law are designed into our everyday at the urban scale, at the visual communication scale, even into our cognition, that we don't even think about fastening the seatbelt. It's so deeply embedded in how we behave into our cognition and our behavior as we drive our cars. So in this way, design and architecture has always been part of putting policy, putting law into everyday reality, from the macro, the meso, through the micro, and even biopolitical scales. And this has been studied, I would say, more in architecture, and scholars from STS, the field of STS, like Sibley and Cavici, and many others, have been part of helping us and turning towards design to look at how these laws, how this governing matter and the role of architecture and design in this kind of everyday forms of governance, or what I would call governmentality. So Langdon Winner is one of those STS scholars who many years ago already talks about the link between statecraft, between government, between governance, the rules, the roles and relations within our social political life, how architecture is part of the establishing, the making tangible of these interfaces, making physically unavoidable behavior or compliance with laws. And he calls this political ergonomics, design and architecture doing the ergonomics of policy, of law, of compliance with different kinds of national or local policies. So I would argue that this is a much longer, larger precursor to the present day design wave, in which design is engaging with policy. Here's a different set of designs, different set of disciplines or interdisciplines in and around design that are part of doing this political ergonomics for centuries, for literally centuries and centuries and centuries, for many regimes. And I would argue that the political dimensions might be more explicit in architecture than design because of its histories and a legacy of writing architecture history, which we don't have so substantially in design, legacy of its histories of service to states and empires, democracies, as well as dictators. So there are histories of architecture in service to other kinds of regimes than those democratic were the ones that we're familiar with in our everyday realms today. And this sets the stage for the case study that I looked at in Cape Town some years ago now. This is some photos from my field work conducted, again, now quite some years ago. This is an exhibition inside the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, South Africa. And here is a story in the exhibition context of how architecture was implicated in the national project of apartheid, the social and spatial planning of apartheid. The 1950s Group Areas Act zoned municipalities for mutually exclusive and racialized land ownership and occupation. There were 4 different groups, and the social planning separate those 4 groups was instrumentalized through architects and urban designers making those 4 groups physically separate, isolated, and bounded in the space of Cape Town. So the 1950s Group Area Act was about separating peoples through architecture and urban planning. The act was instrumentalized through large-scale property expropriation and the forced relocation of 1.7 million people. And here you can see in this exhibition a report on the Commission of Inquiry into matters relating to the colored population group, a reference to Surprise, our European architectural legend, Le Corbusier. And certain ideas or interpretations or instrumentalizations of his theory for doing this apartheid social and spatial planning, the separation of groups from one and another, and the expropriation of land from one for the interests of another. It is through the surgical method that they interpret from Le Corbusier to reorder their society along apartheid lines. So in this notion and this kind of evocation in the exhibition here, the principles of European modernism were referenced in defense of the hard divisions, the clearances, the borders between areas. And this is what Michel Foucault, the political theorist, would call kind of government and the transition between government and governmentality, which is the thing I'm exploring in my paper about this case study in Cape Town. Le Corbusier, in his notion of governmentality, differentiates between different paradigms of governance, where previously governance was done by top-down rule, by a sovereign of a territory through physical force, hard state power through military and physical means, making borders, making walls, enforcing those with police and military. And architecture had a very strong role in doing that border creation and the separation of those state-led governments for centuries and centuries and centuries. But what Michel Foucault traces is the shift to another kind of paradigm called governmentality, which is not so much the hard borders that are physically impassable and put there through architecture or large-scale infrastructure, but a range of softer kinds of tactics or technologies of control. And I'll just refer to the last bit of this quote here. The instruments of government in this notion of governmentality, instead of being laws, now come to be a range of multiform tactics. We can think of the cognitive habit of fastening our seatbelt. We can think about the seduction of different ways to be good citizens in public space and ways of discouraging or nudging out undesirable way of being in public space or undesirable people in public space. So now we may not have, or we still do have, physical barriers barricades for protection, for defense, for separation. But we also have a range of new multi-form tactics through which people are made to feel that they belong or not, through ways people are nudged or not, through different forms of what we might call soft rather than hard power, which are also potentially designed. And here I come to the case study context of the project called VPUU in Cape Town, which I studied when Cape Town became the World Design Capital in 2014. And that date is not incidental. 2014 also marked the 20-year anniversary of the end of apartheid rule in South Africa. And yet, those many forms of that apartheid rule stay on and live on in those hard borders, in those separation of populations, in the uneven distribution of resources, and so on. So the end of apartheid rule and a new kind of emerging from within and alongside coexistent post-apartheid social spatial planning. And this sets the context for a project like VPUU. VPUU is located in Kailicha, an informal settlement where many of the non-white people from District 6 were once relocated to the distant fringes of Cape Town, far from resources, infrastructure, urban appealing places and access, and so on. The settlement of Kailicha and the project of VPUU exist in an uneasy post-apartheid planning context in which the hard borders and legacies cannot ever be entirely erased by today's governments, much less can be solved or resolved by a VPUU project, much less by design. VPUU, as you can see here in the posters that met me and all international travelers at the airport in Cape Town when I visited there, stands for Violence Prevention to Urban Upgrading and is really highlighted as a design project, as one of the main projects in Cape Town as World Design Capital. So it's a design project, according to Cape Town, who invited it into this to be featured and spotlighted as a in the World Design Capital, and by those in VPUU, which positioned it as a design project in various ways. The way that VPUU does design may sound in some ways like design. So you can see in the picture here, there are some design elements. There's a series of public walkways through Kailicha. There's areas for sport and gardening. There's what they call active boxes. I have a picture here that are always opening and visibly lit up as safe houses and community centers. So they do violence prevention partly through this spatial intervention, the lighted walkways, the places for gathering and being safe, the making public spaces appealing and safe for many kinds of people. So there are design or architectural elements in VPUU. There are these traditional architectural forms of doing government. But there's much more to VPUU than these visible, hard physical forms. This is the three-pillar general model that governs the setup and the running of VPUU. This is a model following the UN Habitat, and it's been designed in VPUU and other settlements around the world as a quote-unquote research-based process with ongoing kind of evaluations and evolution based on studies of how this model works. And this model has indeed situational crime prevention. That's where architecture, what we might really recognize as design, takes part in violence prevention. These sports grounds, the lit walkways, different kinds of physical elements and interventions are designed as part of situational crime prevention. But that's only one of the three pillars for BVPUU. There's also social crime prevention, social and educational programs, and institutional crime prevention, or local institutional building. And we can start to think, okay, there's the traditional area for design and architecture in the lower right-hand corner, but are these other things also now becoming part of the remit of design? That we are designing safe schools, that we're designing youth projects. If this is a design project, we can start to ask, what is design doing in this kind of governmental setup today? And that raises a whole bunch of really interesting questions for design, because that's design well out of its traditional comfort zone, doing things that look like governance, doing things that look like violence prevention, that public administrators, that politicians, that local community organizers, that police might have traditionally been doing. I should say here that this case study I did quite some years ago now. I haven't been able to follow the VPUU case study since then. You may also have more updates than I do based on the evolution of this project. So I'll just also caveat a little bit my understanding of the project with this. And VPUU has continued to build up gradually and iteratively since 2006. This is just one of the newsletters through a whole series of newsletters. This one isn't even online anymore, which says how active has this VPU been since in Kailicha. This shows the three different pillars, how they're doing the reporting on the different initiatives that are planned, designed, and carried out in this space. And it's been iterated through community action plans, interventions, evaluations, management involving many stakeholders, including architects and designers, people properly trained in architecture and design, but also a vast array of community group with different and conflicting politics. A big part of the research, design, and decision making, even if this is branded as a design project, is done by others than the experts, whether politicians or designers, that are normally in charge of doing area development or violence prevention. And it has indeed produced transformation that's clearly evidenceable in health and crime statistics. So in my case study, I see VPU as an example of modern forms of governance. In this case, security policy, conducted not from the top government down, but through the interface of something called VPUU, a more networked, interactive way of doing governance, of doing policy, through an assemblage of stakeholders, local and global financing, models, and competing governmentalities of the different stakeholders involved, in which design is increasingly instrumental and maybe even claiming all of the actions in and around VPU as something perhaps called design. And this is a really interesting turn in design, in my opinion. So VPUU, as I study it as a case study, it's a key intermediary between the state and the populace, in which there are a variety of tangible and intangible interfaces designed by architects and designers, but also by others. And the forms of governmentality, the way through which governance takes place, include physical interventions like the towers and the walkways, also various GPS and mobile phone-based services and safety monitoring. But beyond that bottom right-hand pillar, the visible or tangible, intangible kinds of things we recognize as design, there's a range of other things which are designed. And in my paper, I actually talk about these less design-like things in VPUU. For example, there's a committee that does all of the planning and decision-making around VPUU. It's called the Safe Node Area Committee, SNAC. And we could potentially see a SNAC as designed in the way that some scholars are talking about parliaments as designed or democracy as designed, with carefully planned membership and representation policies. Who gets to vote? Which different political parties, which different faith and other kinds of groups are invited into that and can vote? And how are they enrolled into being members of that committee through various training, planning, and decision-making processes? How do they designed into their ways of being a committee that then does governance? So potentially even the institution of a planning committee can be seen as an object of design. from this governmentality point of view. In the paper, I also talk about other complex and precarious governing arrangements that since 2009, for example, the task of tenure certification fell to the SNAC, to VPUU. This is a very weighty topic in the context of South Africa and its governments, which have promised housing to people and tenure certifying who can own and live on a space is highly contested as part of that politics and some might argue failures of those politics in certain ways. And that task of doing the tenure certification fell to the SNAC and the VPUU, who did it in slightly different ways, where women, for example, were listed on tenure certificates, therefore having a share or a stake in ownership or residency in places. So there's also then a politics and a normative stance that SNAC took in relation to other differently organized processes of tenure certification. And this is a role that design is doing. It's giving tenure, it's giving land. If we see VPUU as a kind of design project, it's empowering different parts of society. It's literally giving certain people access and privilege and property and not others. So this case study for me shows how physically and politically functioning kind of governing matter, maybe traditional kind of architectural matter and design matter, but also more social forms like committees and tenure processes, workshops, environments, infrastructures, organizations, all of these soft forms of design work, of design organizing, can be understood and studied as objects, as instruments, as agents of government. So potentially this turn of design towards other forms of interactive and networked governance, in this case VPUU, also requires a turn to a more critical and politically aware foundation for design and architecture itself. Less only one kind of governmentality, that of experts, that of designers, becomes the way a highly complex and variegated and heterogeneous and contested context like VPUU would be potentially colonized or controlled by some experts at the expense of others. So which knowledges, whose knowledges are design convening in these kinds of projects? How can we gain a critical understanding of what the governmentality is that design does, who it's acting on behalf of, and how might it be counteracting or representing or opening access for others in these processes? And this I find really an interesting way of thinking about the turning forward and back that might be necessary as design expands from its traditional role into other more complex kinds of governance like this VPUU case study. I'll turn to a final example, which is a bit of a counterexample. So the VPUU is a bit bridging for me the older forms of design and government, architecture, making cities, urban design, making cities, political ergonomics that has long been done by urban planners, architects, street designers, graphic communicators, etc. To the more intangible and modern, we might say, forms of design, the kinds of design that are entering now into policy spaces, these softer multi-form tactics, creating institutions, making workshops which convene certain people, which privilege and build certain kind of consensus, or try to build other kinds of voices or plurivocality or even dissensus in these contexts. So VPUU is different kinds of design in government. And this is an example in this dialogue created with the colleagues, Lucy Kimball, Catherine DeRose, and Liz Richardson, of the thing which we probably more typically associate with a contemporary design wave. But I think we also need to ask critical questions of this design wave as well. This is a dialogue between the four of us, but also involving many, many others. This is the reference to the report that came at the end of a 18-month funded project here in the UK, but involving many different researchers and practitioners around the world, including, I know at least Mariana and maybe also you, Katarina, or others here have heard or were part of these dialogues. And it was a network that built up through dialogue different kind of perspectives on the intersection of design and policy. And the report shows different kinds of case studies, different kinds of landscape features of this debate and emerging design wave. It also unfolds a bit of the proposition that the four of us in a core group behind this network started to discuss around, which I'll show you in a minute. And and you can also, if you're interested in following this, you can join our LinkedIn group. There's also a podcast with the four of us linked in the slides as well. And what was really interesting for the four of us, Catherine that comes from political science, Liz that comes from public administration, and me and Lucy that come from design, is that we really kind of looked at how those disciplines met and spoke to one another. So not only thinking of design as something that does the work of policy, that makes their lives easier, that can be a way of, making policy more acceptable or increasing compliance, but really looking quite fundamentally of all the different things that design can do and relate to in policy making. And we came up, I outlined a bit of this in Helsinki. I wasn't sure how many of you from Helsinki would be in this room. You're welcome to go look at the whole, there we go, one at least. You're welcome to, actually, at least. You're welcome to go listen to the whole version of my lecture, which is much longer than this short bit I'm telling here now. And also the slides are at the link, which you can go to in the slide here. And this is not fully yet published, so I'm only showing bits of this. I'm only talking about bits of this until the article does come out, hopefully quite soon. But what we did with the four of us, we're starting to look at what are these relationships between design and policymaking? What is design doing when it gets into the business of policymaking? And this was one of the most obvious relationships that we found between design and policymaking. Design being a useful tool for policymakers. Design thinking is another way of doing workshops that they're already doing. Design maybe bringing in different voices or participation or lived experiences in ways that can be instrumentalized in policymaking for doing better or differently what they're already doing. This is where I would say most of design in policymaking is placed. Design making existing policymaking easier, more efficient, more informed, more kind of perhaps grounded in human centricity, et cetera, making it more accessible. But there are also other roles that design can have. Design can be brought in as a practice of improvising within policymaking. And I wonder if VPUU is not an example of this. Through long-scale kind of evaluation, iteration, experimentation phases, not ever doing policy the way that policymakers thought it should be done, but doing it very differently and evolving even how policymaking happens along the way through the inclusion of different groups, through the trial and failure of different kind of initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe living labs could be another example of this, or large-scale kind of culture of experimentation programs in Finland, for example. So design not doing policymaking how policymakers are already always pretty much doing it, but doing it very differently and thinking of those processes of doing policymaking as design in themselves. So these are two quite different purposes of design and policymaking. One of them, the orange one, is design on the terms and on the territory of policymakers. The blue one might be decentering some of the ways that policymakers see policy, but policymakers see as valid participants. Policymakers might even see where policymaking should be taking place, not in the center of Cape Town municipality, but in the settlement of Khayelitsha and involving very different kinds of environments, interactions, and convening kinds of arrangements than would ever take place in the city center with the central municipal government there. So perhaps there's a role in this that policymaking could be made more open in the face of unfolding events and experiences, including some of the really disruptive things that happen in a place like Khayelitsha. And I won't go into this second-hand columns here. You can look to the recording of my full lecture to hear a little bit more about those. The third relationship that we see that design can play in policy or in relation to policymaking is generative. And here we might see that design is regenerating policymaking altogether. It might be taking policymaking out of government entirely. It might be taking it into other places, into other territories, and other knowledge regimes far beyond that of traditional policymakers. For example, as we might see, different kind of land use and resource rights negotiations happening in relation to Native peoples and territories, where it's not at all negotiations should be taking place on the terms of one group over and subordinating another group, or even ever fully being consensual, but trying to recognize and maybe destabilize other forms, other knowledges, other ways of seeing the world than would ever necessarily traditionally enter into the halls of government or traditionally policy-making kinds of contexts. And this is where design might be disrupting or unsettling assumptions about policymaking. And it might look nothing like what policymakers are currently doing today. This is our framework roughly set out in the report that I showed you earlier, and a bit more detailed set out here in this table. And just to wrap this up, in this second half of the design and government conversation, we see design as meaning many different things in policy in this current design wave. It can be many, many, many things called design in this current present day design wave. And there's been lots of different ways of trying to define design in policy making. Some of them are overly specific, like individual case studies, level of specificity. This is what design looked like, these 5 case studies. Here's what a definition of design in these 5 best practices. Many of these definitions of design in policymaking tend to be over specific, or they tend to be overly general, claiming things like design brings human centricity, or design brings creativity. But by no means are those ideas only the purview of design. Many others are creative. Many others are human-centric. So we tried with this table, with this typology, to go somewhere in between this overly specific and overly general attempts to define design. And our topology of these 3 relationships are each anchored respectively in different sets of literature within policy, public administration, and in design. So quite deeply anchored in different discourses in both disciplines. I'm not going to cover all of these points here. I can go into this more later, but our main contribution in the paper that we hope to come out soon is to problematize design's relationship to policy as only ever in service to. Design in this instrumental frame is in service to policymaking. Policymaking is not destabilized. It retains its boundaries, its edges, its ways, its ontologies, its ways of doing, its ways of thinking, its forms of evidence. That's where design is mostly in service to policymaking. But there are other ways that design can relate to policymaking as well. So in our forthcoming paper, we problematize the relation between these disciplines and which is turning to which, and what is design's role in that turning towards different kinds of knowledges, whether that's design knowledges, policymaking knowledges, or other people's knowledges in different kinds of settings. In conclusion, so in this design wave that is a bit of a microcosm of the larger, what I would call design turn, the design wave in policy needs to kind of unpick some of these critical questions at this inflection point. And I've offered two critical perspectives on that. One through this design governmentalities, really looking at these older as well as newer forms of design, what's being claimed as design, and really analyzing the politics, the political action and agency that design is doing in those settings. And really also questioning whose knowledge is, which knowledge is design engaging in those or privileging in those. And VPUU, I think, is quite a good example of this because it's such a highly contested environment at this particular kind of anniversary of the post-apartheid era, where the politics were highly acute in a project like this. And in this design and policy, looking at these three roles and really trying to separate out them, which is a work in progress. We're still really trying to figure this out. But altogether, proposing that through this more critical practices, critical analyses of design, we can deeper our understanding of what's happening with design, what's at stake as we claim and do design in these different settings, and perhaps needing to turn towards other disciplines or unground our foundations, look a bit at the agitated edges to better understand issues of power, ethics, ontological questions, which knowledges, whose knowledges are at stake in government, but also outside of government in policy making. And also, I think that through this kind of critical perspectives, we can need to engage more substantially with other disciplines. So not just adding design thinking into policy making or tools that can be picked up and put down again, but what is really at stake when you put these different ways of understanding the world, ways of seeing the world, not only design and policy making, but the other ones involved. What is happening in this inter-transdisciplinarity? Is this integrative synthesis in Andrew Barry's terms? Is this agonism, antagonism? Is this subordinate service? What are the roles or relationships between the different kind of knowledges, the knowledges in our academies at this intersecting space of design and government, but also the places in which actually this policy making is felt and could be seen to be done outside of those disciplines, outside of our traditional notions of where policy making takes place as well. And that's the end of my presentation. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. And I have no idea how long I've talked. So maybe somebody can tell me.
Yeah, we have some minutes over for questions, I think, Ramia. Thank you for a great presentation. It's really interesting to kind of knowing how disciplines could meet and interact for some greater good here. So do we have some questions from the audience? So please raise your hands or let us know through a question on in the chat or something. Yeah, Rolf, please.
Yeah, thank you for a very inspirational lecture. I have a very basic, silly question perhaps, but you keep referencing to architecture, which I think is a very interesting comparison here with a long prehistory. And I think one of the things you see in the field of architecture is that the struggle, so to speak, is not perhaps solved, but they do these architecture theory papers all the time, trying to motivate themselves, explain why they are doing this, and sort of get some kind of, well, reassurance that they are doing the right thing. And do we see anything similar in the design field? I mean, that's also sort of part of this self-reflection thing.
Indeed. It's also part of this understanding how different are the disciplines of architecture and design. Architecture is a very coherent, centralized, nationally accredited discipline with a set of quite firm foundations compared to design, which is much less regulated, which can be almost anything, depending on where you are. The fact that when we did design facultaten, we had 19 different universities that sent doctoral students to design facultaten. When they did the Architectural National Doctoral School, there were 4 main universities. So already that says something about the constitution, the kind of institutional coherence versus more distributed kind of nature of design in the university system in Sweden, but also perhaps more generally. So there is obviously the difference between disciplines. And you're right that also architecture has a much more established tradition in the academy. And there have been all sorts of quite interesting developments and debates in that. And the very clear separation at one point in time from design, between design theory, design history, and design practice, in order to make sure that history and theory were really critical and independent of practice. And there was a whole debate about this in the 60s and the 70s. They weren't just studying practice, they were really trying to criticize and develop critical theories to push back on some of the things that were happening in practice. So there was a bit of checks and balances built into the architectural education or certain kind of institutional ideas at a particular point in time in architecture. And if you compare that in design, we don't have that. We've ridden this design wave. Design only entered the academies, at the third, the second and the third cycle of learning. And not even that in many countries within the last 25 years. That's a kind of design wave that I've been writing. So we don't have these kind of really necessarily different communities of design history, design theory, drawing on different kinds of more historical reflections and politically acute kind of critiques that are separate from design. There are different communities within design research that can have those characteristics, but generally our practice and our theory and our history are much more mixed up and can be hard to distinguish, can be hard to step out and have the critical distance from one's own design practice or nearby other people that are doing something called design research, which, yeah, it's a bit more muddled in design and in design research. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we can't escape it either. We've come at a certain moment in time, our institutions look as they are. We, in fact, might have different kind of possibilities by being closer between theory, practice, and history. But yet I do argue that we need to deepen the foundations of design research, particularly as we go in and turn towards other disciplines. If it's nanotechnology and biology, we can't do that naively forever. We will have teenager years and we need serious kind of maturation as well, if that's going to be not simply imported into biology and another way of doing biology that's not called design anymore. And actually, an interesting case in point, which I forgot to mention, in this dialogues with Liz and Catherine and Lucy, we uncovered different dimensions of a whole area in public administration that's called design science, that has been doing what it sees and calls and recognizes as design since kind of Herbert Simon 30 years ago. So there's a whole parallel discourse far from design in public administration, which doesn't match onto some of the, discourses and theories which in contemporary design. So part of our work is to kind of rediscover those, parallel histories in other disciplines, and deepen, the kind of relations between design as a discipline today, contemporary discipline, and the foundations of another discipline, say public administration today. So I don't know that answers your question. Did you want to ask a follow-up question or any further reflection on that?
I think, Ramia, we'll have 1 minute left here on my clock, but I will let Hannah also. Do you have a question, Hannah? You can formulate shortly.
Okay, it was more of, I don't know if you can hear me okay with these. Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you so much, Ramia. It's been amazing to listen to you. And this morning we were also discussing one of these articles that you mentioned in the Experio Lab study circle. And we were talking then about, I really appreciate how you're raising how design is so broad and how there are very many different aspects of or fields of design, and how service design as it's developed and maybe is the main design approach that is used in design and governance is very different to, for example, critical design. But I was also I also thought a lot about how there's a big difference in being a scholar and a professional. Working as a professional in like policy design projects, and you're also funded by government, and you're designing in service of the current system, or in some way, because you are in there, while you can also have this critical view. So I don't know if we have time for that, but it would have been really interesting to hear a bit about also how to work with that, how we ended up here, because I totally agree that we need to be more critical and politically aware of like how we are political in whatever we do, and how it's irresponsible to imagine us not to be. But also we discussed how politics are kind of drawing back, and how these other fields that you mentioned are not really doing maybe what they maybe used to do more before, or what they should be doing more. And also how designers taking that position can also kind of set a light, or like draw attention to how the political system today is not really democratic, or like not really raising everyone's voices. So I think that that's also an interesting aspect, that it would be fun to hear you.
Super point, and very well argued.
Do you have any short answer to that, Ramia? Otherwise, we pass the time.
I never have a short answer
No.
for anything. However, I think it is really useful to think about, I mean, that's another form of agency, right? The design can bring other voices, make other worlds felt, heard, take space. And that involves another kind of governmentality, which is not the governmentality. Design does governmentality in many ways through, different parts of society as well. And you're right, that potentially is what I would argue could be included in this design policy space. So it's not that the design policy space needs to stay in the service design sector. There are many roles that design can have in policy making, including the civil society forums, or even beyond civil society, those who are not counted in civil society, such as future generations in climate policy, such as other species in climate spatial planning. So I do agree that uncentering might mean that it looks like critical design or something that's not design in policy, but maybe we can also widen that box.